Good evening. I think we should get going. Gives me immense pleasure, really, to welcome Ricky Burdett here this evening at the GSD. Ricky's been here for the last week doing lectures on London for Cities by Design, but I think I'm really grateful that he agreed to do a public lecture too for us here at the GSD. So Ricky is a professor of urban studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science, deputy head of the Department of Sociology and director of the LSE Cities and Urban Age program, something he's been sort of running for the last 6 or 7 years, I think. He's a global distinguished professor at New York University and visiting professor in urban design and planning here this semester at the School of Design, GSD, to teach this module of Cities by Design on London. He has really made incredibly important contributions, I believe, to the field of urban design and planning, and design more generally in many important ways. I think, first of all, he has played a key role in his capacity as a facilitator, curator, and a public intellectual in both the architectural scene in London and as well as more globally through several sort of initiatives he's been involved with. He was chief advisor on architecture and urbanism for the London 2012 Olympics and an advisor to the Olympic Legacy Park Company. In fact, today morning he spoke in great detail about this project and his role and the role of the development of East London as a result of the Olympics. A fascinating talk that intersected planning questions, urban design, architecture, questions of patronage, governance, and implications for the future of planning really in a city like London. A wonderful talk. And as you know, this sort of site the London Olympic sort of project was a site for much innovation and discussion, not only about the role of infrastructure and architecture for the Olympics, but also how one could actually employ sustainable and strategic ways in engaging with the development and rejuvenation of cities, in this case, the East London sort of area. He was also architectural advisor to the Mayor of London from 2001 to 2006. Again, an important role really in molding the debate of architecture in the city of London. And I know he was mentor to many young architects who had opportunities to build at that time. As a result of sort of the role he played as advisor in this case. He also has curated numerous exhibitions, including Global Cities at the Tate Modern, has been member of the UK government's Airport Commission, I think which is yet ongoing, and also represents number 10 Downing Street on the steering committee for the Old Street Innovation Hub in London. He's a council member of the Royal College of Art and a member of the Mayor's London Promote London Board that he's sort of been active. So you can see from sort of all this he's been doing in London, his role and contribution there has been enormous. In fact, for me, he is not only an academic, but activist curator. So he's a curator, but someone who's also an activist and tends to want to make these things happen, which is sort of important. He's also played an important role in the architectural scene more generally. He was chairman of the jury for the 2007 Mies van der Rohe Prize, an architectural advisor to cities of Genova and Parma, and a member of the Milan Expo 2015. He's on the steering committee. In 2006, as you all know, Ricky Burdett was director of the Architecture Biennale in Venice, and for me, at least for the first time, perhaps in a very long time, the city took center stage. The idea of the city became the device, really, through which the exhibition was organized, challenging the autonomy of architecture as the object to be celebrated in the context of the Biennale. And really, when one looks back at the last couple of cycles, one appreciates more, enormously, really, the incredible contribution that year made, where the Biennale was used as a forum to shift our gaze to the broader context of the city. So I think that was really an important contribution. These were all amazing devices that he used in the exhibition that drew together many stacks of information for those of you who might have seen this, displaying for us new patterns and perceptions about the built environment of the world's most important cities, these beautiful density models that created really a new understanding in the comparative mode between the physical form and use patterns of these cities, questions of inequity, mobility, and many other sort of questions like that that molded our perception and reading of the cities that were displayed. Truly a feast both for the eyes, but really dense with content. Some of these ideas are captured in the two books that Ricky has co-edited, The Endless City and the second volume, Living in the Endless City, published in 2007 and 2001, the first one. The Endless City presents a kind of unique survey of the contemporary city at the beginning of the 21st century and is based on material that has emerged from a sequence of 6 or more conferences held through the world in many cities that sort of come under this umbrella of the urban age, which was really initiated by him as an interdisciplinary investigation into the future of the city. And I think besides several agendas that the urban age pursues, for me, a fundamental question they're asking is that there can be no doubt that cities will grow, but how can we make sure they grow sustainably and, more importantly, more equitably? And I think the question of equity is something that they have struggled to surface and to articulate in productive ways. The urban age is now about a decade old. It's led to a series of conferences with mayors, civic leaders, academics, architects in various cities, such as New York, Shanghai, London, Mexico City, Johannesburg, Berlin, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Istanbul. And it is really, it's a platform. I think Ricky leads it, but he was telling me it has over 50 researchers. It's a wonderful synthesis of all of this research work, which creates an incredible database, but also surfaces important questions. And in his words, the Urban Age conferences more or less always cover 3 or 4 big themes: how the city is governed, how people move around, how public space and housing work, and we're increasingly interested in the impacts of climate change. The overall theme has been a simple one: to understand what the issues for these cities are in an international, in an interdisciplinary way, while trying to uncover what the grammar for success might be. So this is really the heart of the agenda. I can go on about Ricky and what he does, but I think now it's time to hear Ricky Burdett. Please join me in welcoming Ricky. Thank you.
Raul, thank you for that ridiculously long introduction. I was getting calm and warm, and I thought I could have spent the evening not talking. Which is and you all know that one has to take these things with a pinch of salt. What is really important, though, is to be able to share these agendas and passions, actually, which is what they are, with fellow-minded people, and many of you in the room, I have to say. Raul, of course, in particular, but many others who are here from other departments and other universities in different disciplines are very much part of that ongoing dialogue. And it's just fantastic to be able to talk, as I have for the last 2 weeks, to students from everywhere in the world, and mayors from Costa Rica and designers from New York to just engage with these stories. Now, a little sort of health warning that because this is a public lecture, and I have talked already about London, there's a bit of overlap in some of the things. So if some of you have been to my London lectures, I apologize in advance. But what I'm trying to do in response to Raul's invitation of giving a public lecture is to do something slightly different, something new, which is to look at this issue of the infrastructure of the city, the physical structure and structures which define cities, and understand really their impact on social integration. So and by doing that, I want to very much pick up, as Raul has said, on the very, very diverse sort of range of examples and case studies that we've been working on now for nearly a decade at the London School of Economics, to begin to just draw some conclusions, which are not necessarily profound, but perhaps novel ways of investigating the physicality of the city to try and understand what its consequences are, and the other way around. So those are really the axes of what I want to talk about. And I start by showing a diagram that, to maybe a quarter of you in the room will be absolutely obvious, to half mystifying, and to a quarter have no idea what it is. And what it is, in fact, it's a map of London. But it maps particular aspects of London. It maps where you can get to under an hour by public transport. And the purple is under an hour. So if you take a bus, the underground or rail system, and you could get to anywhere else in London, it's in purple. If it instead takes more than 2 hours, it's in blue. So you can see that this is, a map of some sort of difference of accessibility. For those of you, the first quarter know this very well. It's called a PTAL, a Public Transport Accessibility Level Map. And it's the product of a computer, which takes hours to work it out because highly complex things. Now, what you can see, and I will be going back to this, is that clearly whenever you have a sort of geometry of this sort, the center is relatively privileged. But actually, much more importantly, there are pockets, such as this place, such as that place, such as that place, which are purple. Red is then just over an hour. You get a place way out there, way out over there, etc. And the periphery basically is blue. Right? So it's already mapping a form of infrastructure access, which has significance and has meaning. I will go back to this, but that place over there is where the Olympic site has been located. And there's a reason which relates to this. Another dimension that I want to talk about, really bringing the physical and the social together, is something which will be, again, familiar to some of you in the room, particularly those of you who are scholars of Latin American cities. But what it is a father taking 2 children to school on one of the roughly 80 kilometers, or probably now more, of ciclovías, of cycleways built in the city of Bogota. And I don't use these examples, and I will talk more about these in greater detail because they are perfect by any means. There are all sorts of difficulties in all the case studies I'm giving you. But to begin to say that something about the laying of this piece of infrastructure, the political decision to actually build some cycleways from absolutely nowhere to seemingly nowhere else, as a way of allowing this person to take his kids to school and then get on to work, is something very significant. That relationship is very significant. Many of you know, many of you study cities where commuting times are roughly 4 hours a day. Roughly 4 hours a day, 2 hours one way, 2 hours coming back. In Bangkok, some cases, children are put in the back of the car in their pajamas so they can sleep another hour and a half before they get to school and are fed on the way back. Think of what that does to the nature of the relationship between parents and their kids. And think, by contrast, what that does. I mean, I would have loved to have my father take me to school on a bicycle, that sort of issue. So in that sense, I think there are these 2 dimensions of infrastructure meant very, very broadly, and trying to sort of bring it down to an understanding which is physical and human and even psychological at certain certain levels. What I also want to talk about is other ways of describing a city. The first map, the PTAL map, talked about accessibility, one form of equity, effectively. If you're closer to the purple, you have more access to the job market, you have more access to the leisure market, you have more access to everything through public transport. This is another way of looking at the city of London, and in red, it shows you where less deprived people are, less educated, shorter lifespans, I'll come back to that, and in green and yellow, the more affluent. And what you see there is a slightly different geography, actually very different geography from the first one I showed you, because the purple was all over there, and as you saw, most of this part was sort of blue, in other words, less accessible. So here you have sort of 2 areas colliding. And this is what actually most people think of London. Huh? It's actually that. It really is that. Most of us academics live probably there, not there, and all that. So what I'm trying to talk about, what is the connection between the infrastructures, of which I will try and define and talk about them in many different ways, and issues of sociability. Now, 2 of the cities I'm going to be talking about, London and Rio, have made major investments in infrastructure. One over the last few years because of the Olympics, and the other one, Rio, because in a few years' time they will have the Olympics. And I want to reflect again on some of the work, as Raoul has said, that we've done through the urban age in looking at the different forms of infrastructure. As you can see here, not necessarily lightweight or soft touch, which is the bus rapid transit system, which is one of the major investments being made in Rio as we speak. But we just explore with you what the impacts might be and compare that to some of the other systems of infrastructure in other cities. Now, one has to at least start by saying, what is the definition of infrastructure? Well, it could be any of these, obviously. And I think one of the key points is that different infrastructures had different impacts on cities at a different point in the economic, cultural, and political cycle. And I will mainly be talking about some of the ones at the top, rather than ones at the bottom. But I've been reminded in looking at this issue and wanting to share it with you of how infrastructure, and particularly public health infrastructure, in many ways has been at the heart, the birth of, let's call it modern planning. In London in the 1880s, there was the first outbreak of cholera, which devastated actually what was then the largest, most intense, most dense city of the world. It was the first mega city of the world. And through a whole series of actually philanthropic activities and the birth of the London Metropolitan Works Board, as it was called then, was the introduction of the first sewers of London to take out all the effluent, because cholera at that point was thought to be related to basically contaminated water. The result of creating these sewers was not only noticeable underground, the invisible infrastructure, but actually, much more importantly, overground. Because the embankment, this grand promenade, let's call it, actually in some places maybe a motorway, but this potential of a grand promenade on the river was shaped by what actually happened underneath it. So again, in terms of the architectural, the urban design issues here, let alone the decision-making factors, I want to try and talk about the two things. And in some work that we're in fact doing with colleagues in different institutions on re-understanding the Charter of Athens, as it was conceived, of course, in the 30s by Siam and then written up by Le Corbusier, the issue of public health, the issue of how you get to a place and lifting the buildings up into the air and allowing cross-ventilation was absolutely central to the shape of the city, with very, very different consequences, perhaps, than were imagined at the time. Now, those are not the issues that affect most rapid urbanizing forms that so many of you study here today. That's the issue, which probably is more significant. So in talking about these things, I think one has to be aware, what are you actually talking about? Because in some of the work we've been doing recently at the Urban Age clarifies something that perhaps is known but is important to repeat, is that most of the urban growth that is happening, according to the UN, over the next 20 years or so, is unequally distributed across the globe. In green, in fact, is more or less cities that have grown with me in terms of my age, my generation. So it's the darker green, Europe, parts of the States, and actually, interestingly, you can see how Tokyo grew very much at the time. In the light, darker yellow, South American cities, but it's in the bright yellow that most of the growth is going to be concentrated, but incredibly rapid, in many countries, particularly in Africa, parts of Asia, which are low energy consumers and also very fragile states at every single level, political, democratic, and everything else. This is impossible to read as a table, but you know, if we think we're beginning to do well again in London or New York, these are the sort of numbers, that's actually where the growth is happening. So Nairobi, Lagos, Kinshasa, Kabul, Addis Ababa are the top fastest growing cities. Most of these have absolutely no infrastructure with informality levels of 60, 70, 80%. So that's why the challenge is to relate this issue of growth, speed of growth, and infrastructure on what happens to the people living there. Again, well-known research from UN states that 1 out of every 3, at least, of people moving into cities, 1 out of every 3, think of that, as where you're sitting at the moment, will be living in a slum without adequate infrastructure. That, by the way, let me say it now, doesn't mean for me in any way that a slum is an inadequate environment. Some of the richest models in terms of economic vibrancy, the Dharavi example, of course, is well known to many of you through Rahul's work. But the basic issue of absence of the basic infrastructure is significant. But the other factor needs to come in here, even though I'm not going to talk about it in great detail today, which is the environmental impact of cities. And how these two come together is, I think, significant to the discussion on infrastructure. 75% today of CO2 emissions is created by cities, clearly more by the global north and western world. So questions arise as to which model do we actually follow. So there's the social side and the environmental side, which need to be assessed. Now, what we've done at LSE is looked at these two issues and plotted about 300 cities around the world around these two axes. Broadly speaking, the social, broadly speaking, the environmental. Along this axis is the UN's Human Development Index. Broadly speaking, the more you are on the right-hand side, the better educated, better income, better health, etc., etc. No surprise, right? Europe, global north, United States. Along the vertical axis is energy consumption, broadly speaking, something called the ecological footprint. The more you are up there, the more you consume per capita. The more you are down here, underneath this dotted line, you use much less energy per capita. So a lot of African cities are in this area over here. Now, what is important about this graph is that that is the energy that we have on one Earth. I need not make the obvious point. I would be unkind to my American hosts by saying that that is truly unsustainable. You need 5 Earths to keep the system going. So cities actually have an enormous potential of bringing this dimension and this dimension together. And there are models, and the models are over here. It's the European compact city model. Many Latin American cities that I've been talking about and you represent here are equally the same. And it's the most important issues are going to be what happens to Indian cities. Do they go there? Do they go there? Or do they come down into this box in terms of creating sustainable cities from the 2 points of view? And infrastructure is central to that discussion. There's politics, there's design, there's money, there's investment, but the infrastructure of support is what actually makes cities sustainable or not. So let's take some examples. And for those who are Paulistanos and are Brazilians, you must not take this personally. Because again, in every city I use, I'm going to be practically a cartoonist and pick out a number of issues and a number of themes. But São Paulo is the engine of the Brazilian economy, now the 7th economy in the world, having overtaken the United Kingdom quite recently to our great upset. But it's a city which is having an odd form of growth with an emptying out center and extraordinary sort of horizontal push to the edges. Not as severe, let's call it, as Mexico City, but nonetheless with its own dynamic. And a lot of it has to do with the use of the motor car. That is incredibly well known. Everyone understands that. This has got a lot to do with the fact that the motor car industry is very powerful and there's a big lobby in the area. These things are not disconnected. I'll never forget that when Beijing announced that they would be reducing the number of vehicles that they gave permits to on a daily basis to, I think, 500, Volkswagen shares dropped by 22%. You know, those are the issues one has to factor in, which are talked about. Now, of course, what is significant about an infrastructure system like this is this extraordinary incapacity to be resilient. All you need is for a flood, and these things happen all the time, the whole system to be completely blocked. There isn't any redundancy or resilience built to the system, and this will be one of the big themes that I think we need to consider. And if you're stuck in a traffic jam in a city like this, which has average commuting times of 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, and that gets in the way of you doing business, and you can afford to, then you do this. São Paulo has the same number of helicopters as New York and as Tokyo, more or less, with an average income which is 6 or 7 times less. And I have to say, I have actually experienced someone saying, we're going to be late, we have to go and see the mayor, let's use a helicopter. I said, no, what? You know, and went up to the top of the roof, and that's what happened. And, now, is that in any way sustainable? Is that a model? Of course not. And what does that mean in terms of the infrastructure of the city? That's one end of the equation. The other end is what Diane Davis and so many other people have written about very eloquently, is the people being pushed literally to the edge. So the periphery of the city, this is the edge of the city, which, you know, from the back of the room looks like a rather nice place on a lake, is on these incredibly precious water reservoirs, another form of infrastructure of a city like Sao Paulo. Mexico City has this problem in spades, in fact, even worse. Now, when you consider that many of these buildings are informally built, have no access to not only the infrastructure, sewers or running water, but also absence of schools and everything else, I need not say very much what happens to the water quality here. And this is the resource for that city. So infrastructure takes on a different dimension when you begin to think about it. And the question here is one of priorities. What does one value? I mean, I was so struck by this picture in Mexico City. This is what is premiated. You know, in Sao Paulo, people in the favelas, such as the ones that we've studied and Paraisópolis, in some cases, you have very, very simple shacks where the car is given as much space as 2 or 3 beds. And in Mexico City, that very much clearly states that this is not just a vehicle, it's also the main source of income for this particular family. So it's given a sort of priority status. And therefore, everything around the dynamics of that city are based on this notion of privileging access to work in a city which is so spread out, Mexico City, 22 million people, that you can't make any public system of any intelligence work. So large amounts of money was built on building the segundo piso, what you've spent $5 billion knocking down here with a big dig. So this notion that cities learn from each other raises some questions. Now, if I take the issue of physicality, of shape, of density, of distribution of services, and public and transport, just as one theme in relation to work, I want to investigate this from some of the work we've done at LSE Cities around 3 different examples. One is London, one is New York, and the other is Hong Kong. And what we've done here is taken these 3 cities and shown in these maps the residential density on the left-hand side. This is exactly where Raoul talked about the Venice Biennale models. This is exactly what they were, in fact. This is the residential density. The taller the vertical element, the higher the density, not the higher the buildings. It means more people just living closer together. Right? So if there were 10 times the number of people in this room here, same room, it would be further up, etc. And you can see that London, and we compare it to other cities in a moment, is a relatively low-density city, relatively spread out. What we've done here, which is completely new work, we haven't seen it done before, is instead looking at work density. This is how many people actually come into the major office centers of London, which happen to be in the central London or in Canary Wharf. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people coming in mainly through the public transport infrastructure, rail and underground and bus. But as you can see, there's quite a distance between there, and you need an enormous amount of infrastructure to make this work. And in the case of London, we've had 150 years of continuous investment and are still doing it today. It's expensive kit to make it work. Here's New York. Just look back, there's London, city of 8-9 million at that density. Interesting that New York is roughly exactly the same population today, but in half the footprint. If you take just the 5 boroughs, of course, then if you go out, it's much longer. So the density, residential density in Midtown and some of the areas to the east and west of Central Park is actually quite high in not just the height of the buildings, the level of occupation. And you can see that even compared to London, the actual number of people coming into work using public transport is considerable. The system in New York creaky as it is, with the difficulties it has, particularly the absence of east-west connections, but strong north-south, serves one of the strongest urban economies in the world. And you see it literally there. But interesting again that the two are really quite distant from each other. You need a lot of kit to make this work. But it's all about access to jobs and security of that access to job on a daily basis. So let's compare these two world cities, so to speak, we of the global north and westerner, to Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a much higher residential density. In some cases, 3-4 times higher than actually Midtown New York, 10, 12, 13 times higher than most of London. This is the work density, very high, but most importantly, these two are much closer together. Now, those of you who know Hong Kong, you've seen the images, and many of you probably in this room know the city very well, also recognize that having a compact city with work close to living environments and a fantastic public transport infrastructure, and well-connected one, means that average commuting times in London are around 47, 48 minutes. New York is, I think, a bit less than that. Average commuting times here are 11 minutes in a city of 8 million people. That means some it's 5 or 6 minutes, and some it's 10 or 20. Now, the key point I want to raise here, is that a good thing? Well, in terms of efficiencies, in terms of maintaining this particular city-state at the top end of sort of global financial competition, undoubtedly it is. If you just look at the amount of people who use public transport to go to work, in the case of Hong Kong, not only is it 11 minutes, it's around 93%. So practically the whole population, which is, we pat ourselves on the back in London because over 50% use public transport, but we've got an enormous way to go to try and address that. I think the key issue, the key connection here, again, between infrastructure and integration, or literally quality of life, is to do with what is the shape of the city, what is the environment you end up living in. Now, perhaps this is an unkind picture of Hong Kong, but perhaps not. And we did some work during the Urban Age conference that we held there, focus group interviews with people living in some of these environments. Many people making very clear decisions that they wanted to be close to work because it was efficient. They didn't want to spend hours commuting, and it fits very much the mentality of people living and working there. And one of the people we interviewed was someone who's in fact in their early 50s, who in fact retired from work and had downsized and was doing temporary work elsewhere, downsized to a much smaller apartment. The size of the apartment was absolutely minimal. And in the focus group, she says this: I invited my friends over. I wasn't experienced, she says, and I was so happy meeting new people at this sort of new temporary place of work that I invited my colleagues to my home. The gross floor area was merely 300 square feet. You can all think what that is in your mind. It was so cramped that everyone had to sit in rows as if they were at the cinema. Now, I think the most important point for us to just reflect on here, a bit like the father on the bicycle with the 2 kids in Bogota, this is the opposite end. It has a deeply alienating effect. That she said, they said that I had overestimated myself, and since then I've never invited anyone to my home. So this is not the sort of naive comment made by a foreigner, a Londoner, or in fact, in my case, someone who was brought up in Rome, therefore a completely different sort of lifestyle. This is said from someone who's actually chosen to live in these conditions. So again, the relationship between physical form, infrastructure, density, and shape on the human soul, let's call it, becomes very important to understand. So now let's look at the examples of Rio before I sort of move on to examples. This is sort of a quick ride in many ways through some of the issues that we've discussed and discovered while we were there. One of the most interesting things about Rio de Janeiro is because of national politics, mainly of Lula, and now of the President Dilma, there has been this extraordinary drop in poverty, mainly through the use of a policy called the Bolsa Familia, which is providing money to families to invest, to ensure good education, good health, etc. What is the spatial equivalent of this? Are we designing in Rio in particular? Are they choosing to design the environments which have the same potential for equity that we're seeing here? Something like 10 million people. 10 million people have come out of what is considered to be the poverty line and entered the lower middle classes in the last 10 years because of sort of policy. And much of the configuration of the city, not as much as other cities around the world, but all the areas in yellow here are favelas, are places of enormous density, enormous vibrancy, but lacking in much infrastructure. And because of the geography of this city, a lot of it is uphill and difficult to get to. Part of the Olympic project is this massive investment in public transport. Not part of the Olympic project is this new initiative, again, very familiar probably to many of you here, some of you from outside the architecture schools probably less so, which is the retrofitting, the provision of, in fact, ski infrastructure from Switzerland to make these areas, this is a place called the Complexo de Alemão, which is, again, hundreds of thousands of people living very close to, in fact, the city center, and who now find it possible to get to their houses, their schools, in a question of probably 10, 15 minutes, rather than what would have been 2 hours of sort of walking up from the top or down to the shops and everything else. Now, this is a controversial project, highly controversial. This costs $400 million, right? So there is a question here about what sort of infrastructure is the right thing for the right, it's maybe okay to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in Sochi, given who's going to be sort of using it over the next years. But there is a question as to whether this is the correct thing. And in our conferences that we had recently and talked to many of the residents and community activists here, there's a relatively mixed feeling about it, but broadly speaking, the fact that you can actually get from the top to elsewhere in 10, 15 minutes relatively cheaply is seen as a good thing. What is extremely negative about it is that one form of infrastructure comes with another. And infrastructure is not neutral. It's not without any sort of values in and of itself. In the case of this project in Alemão, the word, which I would never want to use, but it is used officially, the pacification process of the favelas in Rio has gone hand in hand with the provision of this system of access. Because at every station at the top of these hills, you have a new police station with the UPP, the new unit of police called the Pacification Police, which is run by the state and not the city, has come in and basically cleaned up these neighborhoods. This is a picture taken by one of my team just effectively a few weeks back. The place is filled with policemen, all with machine guns, and crime has dropped dramatically. Many people talk about living in these areas as an extraordinary condition because their children have been born without hearing gunshot. Now, this may be a form of, in a way, making a rather difficult situation actually pleasant and acceptable. But the relationship between these two is the issue. The fact that the police can actually get there and use even the infrastructure from above to see what's happening in people's houses is not insignificant. So I'm just raising this, again, I think as a piece of making life better for the people who live there. It's laudable. It's just infrastructure is not neutral and can be used in different ways. And when you have conditions of this density, which is another part of the city in the flatter areas, there really becomes a question of what infrastructure is needed in order to sort of balance people's lives. And here I move into the issue not just of transport as infrastructure, but aspects of sort of public space. Much of Rio is like this, very familiar, but very, very little amount of open space. The view is, of course, you've got the most beautiful beaches. Why do you need parks? Well, because to get to the beach from here takes another 4 hours, because this is sort of much within inland. And what has happened was the only project I've seen in Rio of a sort of magnitude, which I think is incredibly interesting is that, oops, has a life of its own, is that an area that was in this very dense part of the city that you just saw called Madureira, a zone which had electricity pylons became effectively redundant. And the city, the mayor's office, have now built a linear park in the middle of this incredibly dense area. I've seen it active, and it's pretty impressive in the way what it actually does. Now, the father of one of the leading activists of the city actually said that, who lives in this area, the activist spoke at our conference, said that for him, the Madureira gives his father a longer lease of life because he just has somewhere to sit and see the world go by in a sort of much lower temperature than anywhere else. Meanwhile, the Olympics is actually attracting the bulk of the money. We're talking about billions of dollars, in fact, $2.3 billion are being spent on these new bus rapid transit systems, not subways, even though that one of those is being built. And these systems, the BRT, the bus rapid transit system, are being built across the city. Now, look at this map just very carefully. This is the famous Copacabana beach. These are the sort of the areas that we know from classic pictures of Rio. In blue, you have the better off areas, the more, the less deprived. In red, you have not just favelas, but you have also many of the sort of outer parts of the city and the north part of the city, which is less deprived in terms of education, life expectancy, and health. It does not escape one that most of the BRT system which is going in now is actually serving the blue areas. Right? So this is an interesting issue to bear in mind when we look at the BRT. This is what that blue strip basically looks like. This is called Baja, and it's where anyone who moves out of the working class and can afford to buy something, and it's very expensive, move into the, sort of these neighborhoods with amazing views of the beaches, etc. And nearly all of these are actually gated communities. So it's a non-city emerging, effectively, being serviced by massive public transport infrastructure, when most of these people actually will be using cars. So I think there's a misfit here in terms of what is happening, however laudable the project is. So what are the alternatives? Well, Colombia, Bogota obviously hits the press these days with Medellin doing wonderful things. I'm not going to talk about that. But Bogota, which I've experienced and followed and we've analyzed in detail at LSE Cities, has done a couple of things which I think are very relevant to this discussion about infrastructure. Because it connects transport with public space and with education. And this has been done at a couple of levels. The city is 7-8 million, roughly the same size as London, on the top of a plateau, and it grows practically without control, also because of the national crisis to do with drugs, cartels, and people leaving the countryside, which is unsafe, and coming into the city. The various mayors who've worked on it basically say, we cannot control that. We can't do anything about that. So what can we do to retrofit the city for the future? I hate the word future-proofing, but I guess it's probably the closest thing you come to. This is what the city looks like. You know, most of it is on areas which are fragile, landslides are a problem, very poor levels of sort of governance and accountability. What the mayor was able to do was actually introduce what is obvious to us perhaps here, the bus rapid transit with dedicated lanes. And Mayor Peñalosa just loves this picture because people are stuck in their cars, the ones who can afford it, while the people who are using public transport are actually getting to work relatively quickly. So this is again an issue of priority. What do you privilege? What can you actually do to make a difference? And you can see the numbers there. Not only drop in air pollution, but commuting times have dropped by 1/3 for the people who need it most. Now, this is again one of those maps with all the black lines showing the BRT systems in Bogota. And probably less visible than before, what was blue in Rio here is light pink, so the better off areas are actually over here. What you see is that actually the BRT systems all go to the most deprived areas. They're actually, it's a political decision to try and sort of relate these two worlds together. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to do with the cycleways and public buildings and public spaces. This is a picture taken roughly in 2001, before all this area over here had basically become occupied by informal housing. And what you see is a cycleway, one of many, built to absorb the city, but before the event. You also see some of, to my mind, the most elegant pieces of architecture by a generation of young Bogota architects, or more established in some cases, of libraries and schools and public spaces. Basically, what happens in one of these is this. It's an excuse not just to build a cycleway, but to actually put the infrastructure, water, sewers, and everything else underneath it. And again, the mayor of Bogota, when I happened to be there with him, feels very happy that this space is paved and this for the car is not. Says people will have enough money over time to sort of deal with that issue. And it's, of course, that's what the infrastructure allows the informal city to develop around. So underneath these roads are the sort of sewers that I've described. And that is the one, those are the routes that are used by this guy to take his kids to school. There are some of the libraries and public spaces actually built at the heart of it. And what is interesting is that inside these schools, again, a decision about a different form of infrastructure, which is access to education and to the right levels of IT, the levels of learning, the levels of actual ability to read have gone up so high that it's one of the sort of better sort of qualities of literacy in the whole of Latin America. So let me use exactly that same analogy and bring it to London. And I'm going to begin to conclude to talk about how does the infrastructure of an event like the London Olympics deal with these issues, and then go out more broadly and focus on some other initiatives, in fact, mainly in Mumbai, which I think address exactly the same concerns that we've been dealing with in London over the last decade or so. I've shown this map before, and it reflects very much the inequality of London. Another way to talk about our inequality is that if you take the underground line, which is known the Jubilee line, and you take it at Westminster, which is the salubrious, well-off West London, every tube station you take, you lose a year in life expectancy. Right? So this is the difference that you have in cities at the north end of the Latin American continent and the southern end, or between Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong. These are inequalities which are to do with poor health, bad diet, terrible education, higher levels of overcrowding and levels of migration. They're not things that can be dealt with just by infrastructure. It's much more complex than that. What is important in terms of the issues we're dealing with in terms of planning and design is that this issue of inequality is at the heart, effectively, not only what defines London, as you can see from these statistics, but also the rumblings that happened of dissatisfied people in terms of the services that they're given and access to goods, education, and everything else. So when the decision was taken to pour a large amount of public money in a piece of London, the fact that it was concentrated in one of the hotspots, effectively, of deprivation, I think made a lot of sense. And politically, the sort of the manifesto, the mantra that was used, a word that I'd never heard of before in planning, of convergence, was used. And convergence simply means that the next generation of people who are going to be growing up in East London will have the same opportunities broadly than those elsewhere. And I think that's an interesting way of saying it. So what can you do physically which affects that? Well, there'll be many people across universities and across health departments that say, well, actually physical environment has got nothing to do with it. You guys who are thinking of planning and design, you're sort of imagining that you have an impact. But I think the approach here was at least worthy of description. When the Olympic site was chosen for most of the venues for the games and the athletes' village, etc., this very large but highly fragmented site, cut off from its surroundings by motorways and railways and many other things, was the ideal venue because it's actually very accessible by public transport. But going back to the infrastructure issue and the social issue, it was also an area that was impossible to build on because it was crisscrossed by these pylons and electricity marching its way down from the northeast, bringing electricity and water down to London. Surrounded by a very rich network of migrant communities, partly Bangladeshi, partly Pakistani, other Asians and others, left and right. On one side, one of the highest concentration of artists actually anywhere in Europe, in Hackney. So this is not in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of somewhere. And the question is, what do you do to actually make these two things work? But the site itself, as you saw from that aerial picture, is also incredibly polluted. It was used as a dump. Every fridge in London was actually deposited here with enormous negative impacts in terms of pollution on the ground. The first $500 million of the Olympics money went into getting rid of the pylons and building this vast tunnel for electricity lines coming in and keeping London sort of connected. So infrastructure needs to be understood at different levels. And let me just very briefly go through the planning strategy to understand how just in Bogota, the ciclovías in a way created the veins for potential sort of access to jobs, to democracy and other infrastructures. In London, in a way, the attempt has been very similar. The site is owned by the Mayor of London, very significant, that there's been an ability to intervene in a way from above and take decisions away from either private interest or divided local interests. Very controversial, but it was done because of the deadline of the games. You've seen images which talk about the fact that there's water and there's green, so the idea was to basically put a park at the heart of it. Up until 2005, there was only one street going from east to west, one, in this very large area, 200 hectares. So much of the money was spent in trying to create an integrated network of routes and connections, 38 new bridges and connections. Housing and jobs were placed next to very good public transport. And then what was decided is to only build, this may seem obvious now, the infrastructure you need in terms of sports venues and other things, and make everything else temporary and just get rid of it when you've finished. Now, probably the most important diagram of the Olympic project in terms of planning infrastructure is this one. Once you've taken away all the temporary things, you've cleaned up the site, you've provided access, you've built schools and other facilities around it, you have an opportunity of actually making pieces of city. So it becomes a very urban design issue, and that's what's led to the master plan, which now regulates the wide area. This is what that area very close to Fridge Mountain actually looked like during the games. There's the velodrome building and the park which is being built around it. And in a few weeks' time, this velodrome will be accessible to whoever lives in the wider community. Infrastructure of the Olympics is always oversized. Vast empty spaces which get filled by 200,000 people when they all come out of sports venues. Each of the bridges was designed, and you can see a picture on the construction, in two parts. A temporary part, which was just for the games, and a permanent part which remains in the legacy, in other words, to serve the community over time. Otherwise, you would have a bridge which is, 3 times as wide as this room, with 2 kids and a dog going through it. I mean, that was the notion. So there is this sense of, what is the appropriate scale, which is a very 3-dimensional issue, very architectural engineering issue, which I think has led to the notion of, and these are pictures that taken only a few weeks ago, of this larger park in the north, and you can still see a lot of work being done on downsizing and civilizing, humanizing some of the infrastructure. I mentioned that many of the venues were temporary. So we don't play basketball in London, even though this very beautiful building was built by Wilkinson Eyre. It's been dismantled, and the different parts are being sold on and shipped elsewhere. The most canonical project is Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Center. Beautiful shape, dolphin-like, with 2 swimming pools and a diving pool inside. This is what she envisaged with her team 7 years ago when she won the competition. Unfortunately, neither she or anyone else ever saw anything like this. That's what we saw. Not very pretty, but it's very functional. Why? Because these side wings hold 16,000 temporary seats. When you have a community pool, and I actually read on the news today that it's opening on the 1st of March, when you have a community pool, this is what it's going to be. You don't want 16,500 seats empty when your child is swimming. Right? So what has actually happened since the day of the end of the games is that this has been demounted, the side wings, and this is one of the first pictures, in fact, seen outside the UK, of what the structure now actually looks like. So the whole area here to the south is being reconceived as a sort of more dynamic park. Even buildings which seemingly had no way of being retrofitted into sort of possible use were designed so that they could be actually cut up. And now this will be the place where there will be 6,000 jobs. It was the major media center where NBC Sports filmed the events and interviewed the gymnasts. This is actually what's happening now, bringing sort of jobs to the area. The point I'm making here is that the physical infrastructure, the design of the park, its access, not to mention the obvious things about wiring and energy provision, which is sort of quite state-of-the-art, has at least created the bones, I guess, of a piece of city to come. And these are parts of the new areas that are being now going out to market for some of the 11,000 housing units that will go there. I don't think any of this would have happened here if it weren't for this image which you saw at the beginning, because that's what we're talking about. It's happened because of the fact that you could actually already get there. It's sort of part of the DNA of London, but in a way this project tries to make it even more so. And over the next 10 years, there will be a dramatic improvement in terms of its accessibility through the construction of a very expensive, major project called CROSSRAIL, which basically goes from, those of you who know London, all the way out west to Heathrow Airport, crossing the whole of London to the east and going through sort of the Olympic sites over here and Canary Wharf. Now, if you take exactly the same mapping technique that I showed for Bogota or for Rio, this is quite interesting because for the cost of $23.3 billion, a lot of money, admittedly, 97 kilometers, nearly 60 miles, of a new high-speed line which goes underground, most of the areas that it's actually cutting through are the darker red. Most of them are actually today very deprived and have very low levels of work in that. So I think if you begin to measure this over 20, 30 years' time, it becomes something that could help literally bring convergence to London. Now, I want to conclude by, in a way, coming back down to the ground and bring it back also to this issue of, is there a form of investment in the city which doesn't require that level of large investment, big top-down projects, which might not have the sort of fragility, the resilience that is needed. And I look at this picture of Caracas, or use it to look at with you, sort of in a way, what summarizes the conditions of the modern city today, more or less, in every single part of the world that is growing very rapidly. You have this, which is where the private interests of this landlord end, right over there. You have this, which is a piece of transport infrastructure, which, yes, takes you from here to there, but it doesn't help you get from there to there. So the severance impact, of course, of infrastructure is dramatic. And you have this on the left-hand side. This is what people do. In here, there's everything. There's self-policing, there's schools, there's drugs, there's love, there's sex, there's music. There's everything about it. And that's where Petare, which is one of the fastest growing areas of Caracas, is where it's all happening. But it's how these three speak together, which is obviously the core issue that, Raul, what you teach here at this university, trying to address. And I couldn't help but picking up in the Guardian newspaper 2 days ago this picture and the statistics or the story, the narrative written by, in fact, a friend of ours, which really puts this in context. So here we have in Mumbai a shining new airport, and these are two very important numbers. 40 million passengers a year. That's a big number. That's quite a big number. 101 toilet blocks. That means many more toilets than that, sort of in a city which has a massive under-provision, I'm going to come to that in a moment, of basic facilities. Now, the article also talks about another terminus, sorry, misspelled, the famous Victoria terminus in Mumbai. Now, we're sort of wowed by these numbers, and therefore the investment for something like this is astronomical. It's of the order of the CROSSRAIL project that I've sort of shown you. This place, which has been there for 100 plus years, Victoria Terminus, has 3.7 million passengers a day. All these people, let's say, generalizing, hanging off the side of the train to get to Mumbai, to get to work. So in 11 days, it would hit the same number of passengers in a year in the new terminal. And again, I'm only raising this to make the simple point of prioritization. Where is one putting money and what for and for whom? These are not neutral decisions in terms of what one privileges. When a city like Mumbai, but it could be anywhere, it could be São Paulo, we've seen that, it could be Istanbul, has this sort of problem, which still needs to be dealt with. Now, some people have, great inspirations and decide to build motorways, and as Suketu Mehta said, well, it's the greatest shortcut to the next traffic jam. Now, what is fascinating about these projects is that they get funding. They attract funding from the World Bank, from the IMF, because they sort of solve a problem. There's a functionality issue, which is in many ways very attractive. Whether they solve the long-term sort of infrastructure issues of the cities we're talking about, I doubt. And here I want to end in a way by looking at the physical issues and impacts on the individual in very, very sort of visceral ways. Many of these areas are being cleaned up. In some cases, roads are widened, areas made safer than they are now, and people living in these sort of environments are moved on into new housing. Some of it designed by architects, undoubtedly none of them designed by graduates of the GSD, that is for sure. But they're moved to other places. The notion of relocation is obviously very significant in the fast, rapidly urbanizing city. And this is one of the slums. It's not the famous one of Dharami. It's another one near the mangroves, an aerial view of this slum. And what is striking about this image is that most of us would think that that's an oil depot or something industrial. It's actually the relocation housing, not built that long ago, Raul. No, it's not, must be within the last decade or so. And what was most striking to me was the fact that these buildings effectively have been built at lower standards than the code because they're relocation housing. The distance between each building and the next is less than it normally required because it had to be built quickly and cheaply. Now, the community that actually lived in the area that people were moved from was a community of people from a fishing village who made their livelihood from weaving baskets. So the pavement was everything. The pavement was the space to weave the basket, but also to trade, to meet a person who would come and sort of do business with you, a different form of infrastructure. Here, two things happen. The heat inside these apartments without ventilation was intolerable, no space to weave a basket, and certainly no place to trade. So if I understand it, and this was working with Raul's colleagues at the UDRI, the income of these families dropped dramatically. They had to go and do other jobs, beg, recycle, do other things. And they didn't have money to pay for the lifts, for the electricity, and therefore the lift shafts became rubbish dumps infested by rats in a question of literally months and weeks. Now, this is where decisions about where to invest, how to design, and how to put these different pieces of the jigsaw together become fundamental, particularly when you're dealing in a city, again, as Suketu Mehta describes, has this extraordinary vibrancy and resilience. Now, I want to bring this to an end by bringing it down to, in fact, as it happens, and it's not just because you're here, Raoul, but I think it makes sense. I want to bring it down to a nearly sort of basic form of infrastructure, which is to do with a community toilet that Raoul and I and a number of other people were involved in about 7 years ago in awarding a prize from the Deutsche Bank Urban Age Award for one of the best or most interesting project which just made a difference. And as it happens, I think Raoul's practice is now taken in a way, tried to take this on at a sort of bigger level. And what this is very simple. It's one of the many slums conditions which are, I think, typical, with unacceptably low levels of provision for men and women. And the community here literally just got their act together, cleaned this up, built a new building, separate spaces for women and for men, to the point that the women were able to talk to each other in safety and talk about violence, talk about the problems of bringing up children. In the space above, they created a sort of learning room with a couple of computers, unheard of in terms of access to knowledge and learning. And in the back over there, actually created a collective and communal kitchen, which has meant that the quality of food being provided for the rest of the community is much higher. These, as I say, are sort of visceral forms of sort of infrastructure provision, which I think are much smaller scale than some of the things I've talked about, but as important in terms of trying to understand the sort of different range, different scales of the relationship between sort of infrastructure and integration that I've mentioned. I mean, in this sense, the notion of, you know, the public and the private dimensions, how much money you invest and where do you invest it, how do you leverage public investment to bring in private funding is incredibly important. The debate between the car and public transport is still ongoing, and I think actually completely unresolved, particularly in the cities which need it most. The notion that actually a sort of low-cost, long nicely fit, a language that was used actually with high-tech architecture 30, 40 years ago, in terms of actually the provision of that sort of Bogota-like style of intervention or rickshaws and other things, is incredibly significant thing for us to all study. Because the need for resilience in conditions which are uncertain at all levels, politically, in terms of democratic deficit, certainly physically, challenges of climate change, earthquakes, and other things make places uncertain. But I guess ultimately it's the relationship between the infrastructure and social integration, which comes very, very close to this issue of dignity, which is at the heart of any discussion of anyone living in the cities of the future. Thank you very much.
Take some questions. We have a few minutes for questions. There's one right there. Let me just get the mic to you.
Thank you, brilliant, and you must be quite tired after a week. My question is, have you considered, and do you think it feasible, to have something akin to Amnesty International for world cities? I particularly have in mind Istanbul, for instance, at this juncture, where we met a few years ago back in Istanbul for the Urban Age Conference. I mean, the citizens are marginalized to the point of even being killed to protect just a few trees. Or they have projects like the canal to connect the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, which may prove to be an ecological disaster for the world. Is it possible and feasible to have something like Amnesty International to intervene in many ways, or to call attention to what's happening in the world cities?
Your question suggests that even if it's not necessarily possible, it's certainly desirable and is somewhere one should be going to. I think it does come to also the question of, can you hear me on this? Yeah. To the top-down, bottom-up issue, which is just as important in sort of this discussion. Awareness of what is happening on the ground, which is what an Amnesty International type agency would do is significant. My concern, and it doesn't mean that that is not important, my concern is that most of the people at the top who are making decisions are ignorant of the implications of what they're doing. Most of the people you talk to behind these projects think they're doing very good things. There's no sense of the people who did that housing in Mumbai that it was a bad thing. Look, we've moved people from places without toilets to places with toilets. You know, we've done all that. So I think it's any sort of, I guess, suggestion of the talk of the sort you're talking about makes sense, but I would nearly start by trying to educate those who are making decisions and investments. I would nearly start, again, this sounds as if I'm being negative to what you're saying. I'm not. If the World Bank were to have in its business case checklist something about sociability, I think you probably have more of an impact in the next 10 years than just having your ear on the ground. That would be my point. There is the issue of NIMBYism, you know, that sometimes there is, well, a desire for things not to change or progress, which can hold things back, but maybe we can sort of pick that up, and that, you know, some large-scale infrastructure improvements, such as the sewers of London in the 1880s, wouldn't have met with great support for the people who were living there. But in terms of, you know, I guess the future sustainability of that city, they've been very significant.
Hi. I would like to be back to the idea of efficiency, especially you were presenting this efficiency between New York, London, and Hong Kong. However, Hong Kong, in certain way, is being a planned city under the traditional models of planning. But at the same time, you were presenting Mumbai. So my question is, what are the lessons that should be learned by cities like Mumbai that in certain way are limited by resources? So this efficiency that happens because of this local challenge.
Oh, that's a question for you. No, but first of all, that is absolutely an appropriate question to ask. I think we have to be very, very careful to, you know, generalize from one city to another. And I've been at pains to try and say all one can do is understand certain dynamics and begin to draw conclusions as to how useful they are in solving whatever the local sort of problems are. The lessons from Mumbai, but also many other cities, are the extraordinary effectiveness of very low-cost solutions to everyday problems. Not to mention one of the most effective, efficient, worn-out, clapped-out, exhausted public transport systems in the world. That railway system, the numbers we're talking about, the New York Underground or the London Underground could never dream of. So, I mean, I guess lessons are that Mumbai is a narrow, quite tight city with excellent communication built by British engineers 100 plus years ago. In terms of purely the issues of, let's call it mixed use, live, work, there could not be a better model. That's why I think it's 60% walk to work or cycle to work in that city. But then if you stand back and look at the conditions in which people live, that of course is not acceptable. So it's trying to understand what those aspects are. If living closer to work is which I think it is an aspiration, there are different ways of trying to implement that. The London Olympics is one way of trying to do that. Only 25 years ago, a very close site to there, Canary Wharf, was developed just as offices. Not one housing was actually conceived because they thought no one would actually go and live there, and it was better to have just an office sort of zone. It's interesting how time has gone on, and Canary Wharf itself is now putting housing much closer there. So that's what I'm saying. One would abstract, I think, some of those issues and try and translate them, but in completely different ways for different contexts.
Yeah, I have a question, actually, two questions. Thank you for your incredible talk, first of all. The first one, you spoke about the sort of like the new economies, but I'm wondering what is your views about the northeastern seaboard of the United States, especially in relation to new projects of massive transportation, high-speed rails that are still very much in air. And second, I'm wondering if you can perhaps say something about the investment in BRT versus light rail. Many cities are considering one of each, and I'm wondering if you have any idea of maybe you can develop one and then invest in the other for a longer period of time.
Obviously, I don't know enough about the American examples to comment whether the proposal for high-speed rail in those particular parts of the country make enormous sense or not. In principle, I would be biased in favor of any high-speed rail as opposed to other forms of transport. I mean, it's fascinating what is being proposed in India at the moment in terms of these new linear cities with cargo rail from Bangalore to Mumbai and elsewhere. I think the test, so to speak, of making any of these systems viable and effective is who is served and what is the density of the population that is there and therefore would use it. That would be one of the issues. I think you asked about the light. Is that what you said also?
The light rail, yeah.
The light rail. Versus BRT. Versus the high speed.
Yeah, versus BRT systems.
Oh, I see. Okay, now I'm with you. I'm sorry, I'm missing. There were some figures which I actually show that an effective and well-designed BRT has the same carrying power as rail, with a cost which is a fraction of anything which requires tunneling underground. And that's why, in some places there's no doubt that that is a sort of a better solution. Where you have a geography or topology which doesn't allow for that, then you have to investigate other forms of investment in transport which are much more intrusive and costly nonetheless. But the famous case of Bogota, I think, is probably well known here, that the then mayor was offered, again, a loan from the World Bank and a Japanese contractor who was ready to sort of effectively build the subway for $2 billion. And the mayor rejected that money, saying because it would be serving the wrong communities. It wouldn't. So that was, I would say, a political decision to go for the light touch, more effective BRT, because it was the only one that could get to those fingers of that plan that you saw.
Burj Dubai is basically an example of that spike that occurs during the day with transportation into the city. So that's almost like a replication of your model. And in Beijing, in the last decade, basically, although there were bicycles used on a pretty regular basis, now apparently the bicycles have pretty much disappeared, which seems to be contradictory to the idea of trying to push bicycles when, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but in certain contexts in developing countries, bicycles are viewed as sort of an underprivileged environment, whereas the car is, it represents more of an elitist point of view. And in Caracas, that picture where you have the favela on one side of the street, then the road, and then the modernist interpretation of how density should be. Could you sort of critique the idea of density, of different styles of density, and how different densities actually work better for certain contexts and don't work as well in other contexts?
I want to just preface that. I mean, I don't want to in any way give the impression that I'm anti-car, actually, or that the car is elite. I mean, I think those pictures of Mexico City and how people treat their car, this is their access to work, because there is nothing else that you can use. I mean, South Africa, one could say a similar thing. So it's a question, I mean, for example, London has relatively high car ownership, but very low car use on a weekly basis to go to work. So allowing someone, if they can afford it, to have a car, or spending 2 hours a day commuting in their Volvo, so that's what you want to do. I have no problem with that. Obviously, but I mean, you know the answer to the cycling issue. I think otherwise you wouldn't ask the question. I mean, there is a cultural dimension to these things which transcends anything else. I mean, London cycling has gone up by 22% in the last 10 years in a climate which is not particularly congenial, et cetera, because it's also culturally been seen to be doing the same thing as the Danes. You know, that sort of. In China, are you Danish? Right. No, I mean, in China, again, it's a bigger issue. Many of you have studied it much better than I have. On the issue of density, I think the one thing I would say is this. Even in our sophisticated circles of academics, planners, who talk about density, there is a sort of assumption that high rise equals high density, and that therefore there are limits, right, to how much you can do that. I mean, it's very interesting speaking to Ed Glazer about the issues of density and the benefits of agglomeration economies, etc. The more I think we study the density patterns, which is I think what you're asking me from that image, the more the notion of, let's call it 6 to 10 story perimeter blocks, Berlin, which provide light, air, and access and a continuous street front. The more we understand those models across the world, the more one realizes that actually that's the most efficient way of packing people in certain respects. It's different to the Hong Kong model for reasons that we've discussed and we've seen. So all I would say in response to your comment, rather than try and describe what are the different density patterns as you move across that photograph, but I can tell you one thing, the density on the left, 2-story houses at most, is probably 5 times higher than the density on the right, 20-story houses, 15-story houses. Why? Because each one of those is surrounded by tarmac. Right? So the density actually drops dramatically. So there are issues of that sort which I think are talked about but often get lost in also the disciplinary discussions about these things.
One last question.
So my question was about density too. I think the Hong Kong density is really dazzling. And I wonder if you could speak more about the focus group studies you did. For example, he gave this anecdote of a woman who really, was demeaned perhaps by her 300 square foot experience with her friends. Was that representative, or did others in your study enjoy that level of density? And is that density less than New York looked like it had spikier areas in your maps of New York City? Thanks.
Yeah, this is where, again, the health warning which I put up at the front, that in simply noting patterns in different places doesn't mean one is good or one is bad. And I stress that as someone brought up in Rome, my sense of density, my comfort level is very, very different from someone in London, because mine is higher, right? I'm happy to live in an apartment. Most Londoners aren't, or most English people aren't, which is not Londoners anymore. And that's very different in New York, or for that matter, Hong Kong. I think what struck us in that focus group series of interviews, there were only 40 people, but at least it's 40 people, right? It's not one, was very clear statements that people were making about the trade-offs that the decisions that they were making about size versus amenity versus access to work. And that was one, I've pulled out one extreme, obviously. The younger people who used the public spaces, multi-level public spaces, didn't have that problem whatsoever. They were wise enough to bring anyone in. We didn't interview people living in cage dwellings because you don't have access to them. So there's a whole other. Let me just finish by saying we did exactly the same type of study in London about 10 years ago. And we took 5 different relatively high-density neighborhoods compared to New York or any of these other cities we're talking about. Inner suburbia, polite inner suburbia. But some places were denser. I'm talking about areas immediately south of the river in London or further away. What was clear there is that people tolerated living in, made decisions about living in areas of high density without very good levels of public transport if there was a park. So the trade-off then becomes more complicated. Okay, I can't afford to be in a place, Hyde Park, because I'm priced out of the market. But I'm ready to live a certain lifestyle, particularly if I'm in my 30s with kids. But then, if I'm a different type of person, I don't necessarily need a park and do that. So the issue of density is, even at a psychological level, determined by a whole series of different amenities, of which one and only one is transport.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you very much.